A millionaire gave $350 to a beggar to buy food for her child. The next morning, he saw her at the grave of his beloved who died 23 years ago. Richard Lawson sat at a table in one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants. But all the luxury around him meant nothing. Nothing could fill the emptiness inside him. He stared out the window, watching the rain pour down onto the streets, the droplets sliding down the glass like tears, matching the weight in his heart. The world outside was gray and dreary, perfectly mirroring his mood. Always rainy, always dark, always lonely. It had been this way for over 2 decades. Ever since his wife, Emily, had died tragically, Richard hadn't been able to move on. Her death had left a hole that no amount of money or success could fill. He'd built a financial empire, yet his victories felt hollow. He went through the motions, attending business meetings and lavish dinners. But everything was just a distraction from the pain he carried with him every single day. Richard absent-mindedly swirled the wine in his glass, watching the liquid spin in circles. Business deals, fancy dinners, luxurious events, it all tasted bland to him now. None of it mattered. He let out a sigh, the weight of the years pressing down on him. The truth was, despite all his success, Richard was utterly alone. He had no children, at least none that he knew of. Emily had never wanted to discuss the idea of kids before she passed, and Richard hadn't pushed her on it. Now he regretted it deeply. What he wouldn't give to have a piece of her still alive, something of her to protect and love. Richard paid the bill and stood up, slipping into his wool coat. The restaurant was buzzing with conversations and laughter, but to him, it was just noise, as distant as if it were happening in another world. He walked out onto the wet sidewalk, where the rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. The city pulsed with life around him, but Richard felt nothing but the chill of the rain and the weight of his own solitude. The walk home took him past places that he and Emily used to visit together. Every corner, every building, seemed tied to a memory of a time when life had seemed so much simpler, so much happier. But now, all that remained were ghosts and a headstone. Tomorrow, like most days, he would visit Emily's grave. Père Lachaise in Paris would have been the natural place for her to rest, but for reasons Richard never fully understood, she had chosen New York. Maybe it was because the city represented the new life they'd started together, a life that had been cut short too soon. As he walked along the rain-soaked sidewalk, something caught his eye. Under the awning of a shop, a young woman sat huddled, clutching a baby in her arms. Her hair was damp from the rain, making her look even more fragile. The sight tugged at something deep within Richard. He paused, unsure of what to do. He wasn't the kind of man to get involved in situations like this. Over the years, he'd made countless donations to charities, but dealing with someone in need face-to-face wasn't something he was used to. Yet, there was something about this young woman that made him stop. Maybe it was the way she held the baby, so carefully, with a tenderness that reminded him of someone or something. Richard approached slowly, the rain dripping from his coat. "Here," he said, pulling out $350 in cash he'd just withdrawn from an ATM. He handed it to her. "Use this to get some food for you and your baby." The woman looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, then filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Thank you so much." For a moment, Richard felt something stir inside him, a connection to this stranger, like their pain was somehow shared. He didn't say anything more, just nodded and walked away. But as he continued down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had just witnessed. It was as if something had awakened inside him, something he hadn't realized was still there. When he finally got home, Richard was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He lay down in bed, the sound of the rain tapping against the window his only companion. He closed his eyes, but the image of the woman and her baby kept replaying in his mind. Tomorrow, like always, he would visit Emily's grave. But little did he know, that routine visit was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Richard followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his typical tailored suit, and prepared for his visit to Emily's grave. The gray sky outside his window matched his mood perfectly, and the city was still wet from the rainstorm that had drenched it the night before. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the familiar heaviness settling into his chest as he prepared for yet another somber visit to the cemetery. As Richard made his way to the cemetery, his mind wandered back to the young woman and her baby. He couldn't understand why the image of them lingered in his thoughts. Over the years, he had seen countless people in need, but something about that encounter had stuck with him. There had been a look in the young woman's eyes, a mix of desperation and something deeper, something that he couldn't quite place. It unsettled him. Arriving at the cemetery, Richard took the familiar path toward Emily's grave. The place was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of wind through the trees and the distant hum of the city. He knew this place well, too well. Each visit was the same. He would stand in front of her headstone, talk to her as if she were still there, then leave, feeling the same emptiness he had felt since the day she died. But today was different. As he approached the grave, Richard noticed something unusual. There was someone there, someone kneeling in front of Emily's headstone. His heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman from the night before, her baby cradled in her arms. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Richard stopped in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Emily? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. He felt a wave of confusion and unease wash over him as he cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice low and uncertain. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to compose herself. "I didn't mean to intrude." Richard shook his head, still trying to process what he was seeing. "You were here yesterday," he said slowly, "outside the restaurant. I gave you money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms, as if the connection between them was enough of an explanation. But for Richard, it wasn't. He needed to understand what was happening, why this woman, this stranger, was at his wife's grave. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his voice firmer now. "How do you know Emily?" For a moment the woman hesitated, as if she were deciding whether or not to answer. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and resolve. "Emily, she was my mother," she said softly. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might have misheard her. He stared at the woman in disbelief, his mind struggling to catch up with what she had just said. "Your mother," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible, Emily. She never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Richard felt like the world had come to a standstill. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of her words, but nothing added up. Emily couldn't have had a child. She would have told him. She wouldn't have kept something like that from him, or would she? He took a step back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said, her voice soft but steady. "But it's the truth. My name is Sophie, and Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at the woman, Sophie, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind raced with questions, but he didn't know where to begin. How had this happened? How could he not have known? Why didn't she tell me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would she keep this from me? Sophie looked down at the ground, her expression filled with sadness. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never knew her. She died before I could meet her. I was raised by another family." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He had spent more than 2 decades mourning the loss of his wife, believing he had known everything about her. And now, out of nowhere, he was faced with the possibility that she had kept a secret so profound it changed everything. A secret that had been buried with her for all these years. He took a deep breath, his mind reeling. "I don't understand," he said, shaking his head. "Why now? Why are you here?" Sophie's eyes met his, and for the first time, Richard saw something familiar in them. A glimmer of Emily. "I found out about her a few months ago," she explained. "I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. And when I found out where she was buried, I had to come." Richard stared at her, still struggling to process everything. His emotions were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and anger. But underneath it all, there was something else. A spark of hope. Hope that, somehow, this connection to Emily hadn't been lost after all. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something inside him shifted. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Emily really had been her mother, then this child was his grandchild, a part of Emily that still existed in the world. For the first time in years, Richard felt something other than grief. He didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing. His life had just changed in ways he never could have imagined. Richard stood frozen, staring at Sophie, his mind still struggling to grasp what she had just revealed. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all he could hear was the pounding of his heart in his ears. The baby in Sophie's arms shifted, letting out a soft whimper, and that small sound seemed to snap him out of his daze. How is this possible?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. His mind raced with questions. He felt betrayed by the very memory of Emily, as if the woman he had spent over 2 decades mourning had been someone entirely different. But even in the fog of his confusion, he knew one thing. Sophie believed what she was saying. "I know it's a lot to take in," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've spent my whole life trying to understand too. But I'm telling you the truth. Emily was my mother." Richard's chest tightened. "Why didn't she tell me?" he muttered, almost to himself. The thought that Emily had kept something so monumental from him was unbearable. He had spent so many nights lying awake, thinking about what they could have had together if only things had gone differently. Now, it seemed like those what-ifs had taken on a whole new, painful meaning. Sophie shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with empathy. "I don't know why she kept it from you. I never had the chance to ask her. She passed away when I was still a baby." Richard's thoughts swirled, and he tried to focus. There had to be more to the story. "Who raised you then? If Emily was your mother, why didn't I know about you?" Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at the ground as if the weight of the explanation was too much to carry. "After she died, I was put into the care of another family. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents until recently. All I had was a name and bits of information I could piece together. I didn't even know where to start looking for you until a few months ago." Richard's heart ached. He had lived his life believing he knew everything there was to know about Emily, only to discover that there were chapters of her life he hadn't even read. "So, you came here, looking for answers?" Sophie nodded. "Yes, I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come." Richard's gaze fell to the headstone, his wife's name etched in cold, unforgiving stone. It had been his ritual for so long, visiting this grave, talking to Emily, trying to make peace with her absence. But now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that peace felt shattered. Everything felt different. His memories, his grief, his understanding of who Emily had been. He took a deep breath, his mind desperately searching for something solid to cling to in this storm of emotion. "And this baby," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child in Sophie's arms. Is this my grandchild? Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through her tension. Yes, she said quietly. His name is Daniel. Richard stared at the baby, who looked so small, so fragile. His heart swelled with a mixture of emotions, shock, disbelief, and something else he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Daniel was a connection to Emily, to the life they could have had, a life that had been hidden from him, but that he now had a chance to embrace. As Richard processed this, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. For years, he had been stuck in the past, mourning Emily and the life they'd lost. Now, standing here, he realized that life hadn't disappeared completely. It had continued, silently, without him. And now, he was being given a chance to reclaim a piece of it. But the betrayal still lingered. How could Emily have kept this from him? How could she have made such a monumental decision without even telling him she was pregnant? I don't understand, Richard said finally, his voice hoarse. Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone? Sophie's face softened, but there was a sadness in her eyes. I don't know the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child, or maybe she thought you were too focused on your business to be a father. I don't know, Richard. I wish I did. Richard shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide. Sophie nodded. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you. The idea that Emily had kept Sophie a secret out of some misguided sense of protection left Richard feeling conflicted. He had always believed that Emily trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now, he was beginning to see that there were parts of her he had never really known. Richard's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to Sophie, but to the life he never knew existed, to the possibilities that had been lost, but that could now be reclaimed. What do you want from me? Richard asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife. Richard nodded, the weight of her words settling in. The truth about Emily. The truth he had spent so many years without. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing. His life had just been irrevocably changed. There was no going back to the way things had been. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. Richard stood in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what Sophie had just told him. Emily had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal stung, but it was layered with confusion, regret, and something else he hadn't expected, responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be part of. But they were here now, standing right in front of him. I still don't understand, Richard finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger fading into something softer. Emily never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me? Sophie's eyes flickered with empathy. I don't know what her reasons were, Richard. I've asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that choice, whatever her reasons, and it's affected both of us. Richard took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Emily had always been so private, even with him. They'd had their share of arguments about how much she kept to herself. But this was a secret on a level he couldn't have imagined. Do you know anything about her? About why she did it? Richard asked, his voice tentative, almost as if he was afraid of the answer. Sophie sighed and looked down at the baby in her arms. I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece together what happened. And the truth is, there are a lot of gaps. But I know one thing for sure. She loved you. Richard's eyes widened at that. She told you that? No, Sophie said softly, shaking her head. But I've seen it in everything I've found about her. The way she talked about you to people. The way she lived her life. It was always clear that you were important to her, even if she kept you in the dark about some things. Richard clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had spent years trying to make sense of Emily's death, to come to terms with the fact that they would never have the future they had dreamed of. But this revelation had reopened old wounds he thought had healed. Now, he wasn't just mourning the loss of his wife. He was mourning the life he had never known about, the daughter he had never been given the chance to raise. And you? Why now? Richard asked, his voice strained. Why did you decide to find me? Sophie met his gaze with a steady calmness that surprised him. I didn't find out about Emily being my mother until a few months ago. Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about how I was adopted. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here to find out more about who I am and where I came from. And to be honest, I wasn't sure what I would find. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He could see the weight Sophie carried in her eyes, the burden of a past she hadn't been able to access, a burden that had now become his to bear as well. He glanced at the baby in Sophie's arms, who was now fast asleep. The small rise and fall of the child's chest seemed almost surreal to Richard. This was his grandson, his blood, a continuation of the life he had shared with Emily, even if it had been hidden from him for all these years. Daniel, Sophie said suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. His name is Daniel. Richard's eyes softened as he looked at the baby. Daniel, he repeated quietly. The name felt strange on his tongue, but it was also grounding in a way that Richard hadn't expected. For so long he had felt adrift, like he was moving through life without any real purpose. But now, as he stood here with Sophie and Daniel, something was shifting inside him. I didn't come here to ask for anything, Sophie continued, breaking Richard from his thoughts. I'm not expecting you to play a role in my life, or in Daniel's life. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from. And now I do. Richard stared at her, feeling a tug of emotion in his chest. He wasn't sure what Sophie expected from him, but he knew that he couldn't just walk away from this. He couldn't walk away from her. You're my daughter, Richard said, the words feeling foreign and heavy in his mouth. He had never imagined himself saying those words, certainly not like this, in a cemetery, standing in front of his wife's grave. And that makes Daniel my grandson. Sophie looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was going with this. I've spent my whole life building something, Richard continued, his voice soft but resolute. But none of it ever mattered. Not really. After Emily died, I didn't have anything left. But now I'm realizing that maybe I still have a chance to fix that. Maybe I still have a chance to be something more than just a businessman. Sophie blinked, her face a mixture of surprise and skepticism. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life, Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. I've missed so much already, but I don't want to miss any more. Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Richard could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of opening herself up to someone she had never known. But there was also a flicker of hope there, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. I don't know if it'll be easy, Sophie said finally, her voice soft. There's a lot we don't know about each other. Richard nodded. I know, but I'm willing to try. If you are... Sophie looked down at Daniel, then back at Richard. Okay, she said quietly. We can try. For the first time in years, Richard felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to give him hope that maybe, despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Richard walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind was a swirling storm of emotions. The revelation that Emily had kept a secret this monumental from him gnawed at him, and the thought of Sophie and Daniel lingered in his mind. His life, once so controlled and predictable, felt as if it had been flipped upside down in the span of a few hours. The city around him bustled with its usual energy, but Richard moved through it as though he were on autopilot. The encounter with Sophie had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed by Emily, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility he now felt. Sophie was his daughter and Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping gently against the windows as Richard stood in the dimly lit room, staring out at the city. His thoughts returned to Emily, her laugh, the way she used to look at him, the dreams they had shared before everything came crashing down. He had spent years trying to preserve her memory, to keep her alive in some small way through his grief. But now, with Sophie's revelation, Richard was starting to wonder if he had ever really known Emily at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What was she thinking during those final months of her life? The questions buzzed in his mind, relentless, demanding answers he wasn't sure he could ever find. Richard moved to his desk, where he kept a small collection of keepsakes from his time with Emily, old photos, letters, little trinkets that once meant something to them both. He picked up a photo of the two of them from their early days together, back when everything had seemed so full of promise. They looked so happy, so in love. He couldn't reconcile that version of Emily with the woman who had kept something so life-changing from him. Sitting down, Richard pulled out a worn notebook from the desk drawer. He hadn't touched it in years. It was Emily's journal, something she had kept on and off throughout their marriage. He had found it after she died but had never had the heart to read it, fearing it would only deepen his grief. Now, though, it felt like his only hope of understanding what had happened. With a deep breath, Richard opened the journal. The handwriting was familiar, the elegant script that he had seen in countless notes and letters over the years. He flipped through the pages, reading her thoughts on mundane things, dinners they had shared, vacations they had taken, but nothing stood out. He was searching for something, anything, that might explain why she had hidden Sophie from him. And then, buried toward the back of the journal, he found it. The entry was dated just a few months before Emily's death, and as Richard's eyes scanned the page, his heart began to race. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified. How could I let this happen now after all these years? Richard would never understand. He's so focused on the business, on our future, and I can't be the one to take that away from him. He deserves more than I can give him. I just wish I could tell him, but I know it would destroy him. I can't let him see me like this. I can't let him know. Richard's chest tightened as he read the words. She had been scared. Scared of how he would react. Scared of how her pregnancy would affect their lives. But why hadn't she trusted him? Why had she thought he wouldn't want to be part of it? The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily hadn't kept Sophie a secret because she didn't want him to know. She had done it because she thought it was for his own good. She had been trying to protect him, in her own way, from the burden of raising a child at a time when their lives were already complicated. Richard slumped back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. It wasn't betrayal that Emily had kept Sophie from him. It was fear. Fear of how he would react. Fear of how it would change their lives. And maybe, in some small way, she had been trying to shield him from the pain she was feeling herself. But now that decision had consequences. Sophie had grown up without knowing her father, and Richard had been robbed of the chance to be part of her life. And Daniel. Richard couldn't even begin to process the fact that he had a grandson. He closed the journal, his mind spinning. There was no way to change what had happened, no way to go back and fix the choices Emily had made. but there was still a path forward. Sophie had come to him, seeking answers, and now, more than ever, Richard knew he couldn't turn his back on her. He stood up, his resolve hardening. If there was one thing he could still do, it was be there for Sophie and Daniel. He had already lost too much time, and he wasn't about to lose any more. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed to reach out to Sophie. He had promised her he would try, and now, more than ever, he wanted to keep that promise. He wasn't sure how it would work, or how they would navigate the complicated mess of emotions between them, but he was willing to figure it out. He picked up the phone and dialed the number Sophie had given him. His heart raced as he waited for her to answer, unsure of what he would say when she did. After a few rings, Sophie's voice came through the line, soft but steady. "Hello? Sophie?" Richard began, his voice betraying the nervousness he felt. "It's me, Richard. I've been thinking about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a pause on the other end, and Richard held his breath, unsure of how she would respond. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Yeah, I think we do." Richard exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and right now, that was enough. The next time Richard saw Sophie, it was in a quiet corner of a small cafe, far from the bustling streets of the city. He had chosen the spot deliberately, intimate but neutral, somewhere they could talk without the weight of the past hanging too heavily over them. He arrived early, nervously adjusting his shirt collar as he sat down at the table, waiting for her. His mind was still spinning with everything he had read in Emily's journal. It had brought him closer to understanding her, but it had also deepened the ache of not being able to ask her directly why she made the choices she did. Richard looked up as Sophie entered the cafe, Daniel in her arms. She spotted him immediately and walked over, her face calm but cautious. There was a tension in her movements, like she wasn't sure how this was going to go. "Hi," she said softly, settling into the chair across from him. She shifted Daniel in her arms, trying to make him comfortable before looking at Richard again. "Thanks for meeting me." Richard nodded, his throat tightening with nerves. "Of course," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. He glanced down at Daniel, who was looking up at him with wide eyes, curious but quiet. "How is he?" Sophie smiled faintly, brushing a hand over the baby's head. "He's doing good, growing fast." There was a brief silence between them, neither quite sure how to start the conversation that was looming over them. Richard cleared his throat, deciding it was best to just dive in. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," Richard began, his voice low. "And I found something that, well, it explains a little bit of why Emily didn't tell me about you." Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but guarded. "What did you find?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out Emily's journal. He slid it across the table toward Sophie. "I found this. It's her journal, from the last year of her life. She wrote about her fears, her worries, why she kept you a secret." Sophie stared at the journal, her fingers grazing the edges of the cover but not opening it. "She wrote about me." Richard nodded. "She didn't name you directly, but it's clear that she was scared. Scared of how I would react. Scared of how having a child would affect our lives. She thought she was protecting me by keeping it from me." Sophie's expression softened, her hand resting on the journal for a moment before she pulled it back. "I've spent my whole life wondering why she didn't want me," she said quietly, her voice tinged with a sadness that Richard hadn't seen before. "It's hard to hear that it wasn't just about me, that she was trying to protect you too." Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. "It wasn't that she didn't want you, Sophie. I can see now that she was overwhelmed. She didn't know how to handle everything. But that doesn't mean she didn't love you. I think she was just lost. Sophie let out a long breath, her shoulders sagging slightly. I guess I always imagined that if I found out why she gave me up, it would give me some kind of closure. But now, it just feels complicated. Richard nodded. I know. It's not easy. But the one thing I've learned is that you can't change the past. You can only decide what to do with the present. There was a pause, and Richard could see the emotions flickering across Sophie's face. Sadness, confusion, but also a hint of relief. It was as if hearing those words about her mother had lifted some of the weight she had been carrying for so long. I don't know what to do with all of this, Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've spent so much time feeling angry at her, at you, and now I don't know what to feel. Richard's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but he knew there were no simple answers. They were both navigating uncharted territory, trying to make sense of the mess that had been left behind. I get it, Richard said softly. I've been angry too, but maybe we can try to figure this out together. Sophie looked at him, her eyes searching his for some kind of reassurance. You really want to be a part of my life? After everything? I do, Richard said without hesitation. I've already lost so much time, Sophie. I don't want to lose any more. If you're willing to give this a chance, I am too. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I'm willing to try. But I need time, Richard. This is a lot to take in. Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching it. I understand. We'll take it one step at a time. There's no rush. Sophie glanced at Daniel, who had fallen asleep in her arms, and then back at Richard. He doesn't have a grandfather, you know, she said softly, a hint of a smile on her lips. Richard's heart swelled. I'd like to change that, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she wiped it away quickly. I think Daniel would like that too. For the first time, Richard felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile, but it was there. He had spent so many years believing that his life had ended when Emily died, that there was no way forward. But now, sitting here with Sophie and Daniel, he realized that there was still something left to fight for. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air. But there was also something new, a tentative connection, a chance at rebuilding what had been lost. As they left the cafe, Richard walked beside Sophie, feeling the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. It was a small, almost imperceptible change, but it felt like a sign, and for the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something more. The days that followed their meeting at the cafe were filled with a cautious optimism. Richard and Sophie began to see more of each other, though always with a certain hesitance in the air, as if they were both afraid of saying or doing something that would break the fragile bond they were starting to form. Richard, for his part, was determined to show Sophie that he was serious about being part of her life, but he also understood her need for space. It wasn't easy. Every time he looked at her, he was reminded of how much he had missed, how much time had slipped through his fingers. And as much as he wanted to embrace this new chapter, the past still weighed heavily on his mind. His thoughts often returned to Emily and the choices she had made. He had spent so many years idealizing her, putting her on a pedestal, that it was difficult to reconcile the image of the woman he had loved with the one who had kept such a life-altering secret from him. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard sat in his living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. He hadn't seen Sophie for a few days, and while he wanted to reach out to her, he was also trying to respect her boundaries. It was a delicate balance, one he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate. He knew that pushing too hard might drive her away, but not pushing hard enough felt like he was letting the opportunity slip away again. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sophie. "Can we talk tomorrow? There's something I need to tell you." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The message was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. He quickly typed out a reply, agreeing to meet her, and then sat back, his mind racing with possibilities. What could she need to tell him? Was it something about Daniel? Or maybe something about Emily? Some new piece of the puzzle that would help him understand everything better. The next morning, they met at a park not far from Sophie's apartment. Daniel was with her, bundled up in his stroller, and as Richard approached, he could see the tension in Sophie's posture. She smiled when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but strained. "Thanks for meeting me." "Of course," Richard replied, his concern growing. "What's going on?" Sophie gestured to a nearby bench, and they sat down, facing the lake in front of them. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above, but the atmosphere between them was far from peaceful. Richard could sense that whatever Sophie had to say, it was weighing heavily on her. "I've been thinking a lot," Sophie began, her hands fidgeting in her lap, "about everything, about you, about my mom, about Daniel. And there's something I haven't told you yet." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to keep his expression calm, but he could feel the tension building inside him. "You can tell me anything, Sophie. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Sophie nodded, but she didn't look at him. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the lake, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always wondered why my mom didn't tell you about me. I thought maybe it was because she didn't want to burden you or because she was scared of how you'd react. But I found something recently, something that might explain it." Richard's breath caught in his throat. "What did you find?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to Richard, her eyes finally meeting his, and he could see the mixture of fear and sadness in them. Richard unfolded the paper carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was a letter, an old, worn letter, with the edges fraying and the ink slightly faded. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Emily's. He began to read, his heart pounding in his chest as the words came into focus. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway. I've been keeping something from you, something that I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to tell you in person. I'm pregnant and I'm terrified. I know you've always said you didn't want children, and I've respected that. But now, with this news, I don't know what to do. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to burden you with something you never wanted. So I'm making the choice to keep this from you, not because I don't love you, but because I do. I hope, one day, you'll forgive me for this." Richard's hand shook as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind unable to process the words. Emily had been pregnant, and she had known. She had made the decision to keep it from him because she thought it was what he wanted, because of something he had said years ago, before they were even married. I don't understand," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. "I never told her I didn't want children. I mean, maybe I said it in passing when we were younger, but I never meant it like that. I thought we would figure it out together." Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I think she was just scared, Richard. She didn't want to lose you, and she thought this was the only way to keep you." Richard shook his head, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. He had spent all these years believing that he and Emily had been on the same page, that they had understood each other perfectly. But now, he realized that they had been living with different fears, different expectations, and those unspoken things had torn them apart in ways he couldn't have imagined. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice breaking. "If I had known, I would have been there for her. I would have been there for you." Sophie placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I know, and maybe she did too, deep down. But she made the choice she thought was right at the time, and now, we're here." Richard's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The pain of what had been lost, of what could have been, was almost too much to bear. But Sophie was right. They couldn't change the past. All they could do was move forward. He looked at Sophie, the daughter he had never known, and then at Daniel, the grandson who had been brought into his life so unexpectedly. "I don't want to waste any more time," Richard said finally, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I want to be part of your life, Sophie. I want to be there for Daniel. I don't care how complicated it is. We'll figure it out." Sophie smiled through her own tears, nodding slowly. "I want that too." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still heavy, but the hope for the future finally starting to break through. It wasn't going to be easy. There were still so many questions, so much to process. But for the first time, Richard felt like they were both ready to take the next step. Together. The days after their conversation in the park passed slowly for Richard. His mind kept returning to the letter Sophie had shown him. Emily's words haunted him. She had made a decision based on a fear he didn't even realize existed. And that fear had changed the course of both their lives forever. Richard had always seen himself as in control of his life, his choices, and his emotions. But now, faced with the consequences of unspoken desires and misunderstood fears, he was left grappling with the enormity of it all. Richard found himself sitting in his study late one night, nursing a drink and staring at Emily's journal and the letter Sophie had given him. The faint hum of the city outside provided a strange backdrop to the silence in the room. He felt trapped between the past and the present, unsure how to reconcile the life he had once believed in with the truth that had come to light. He had wanted children. He remembered thinking about it, imagining a future where he and Emily would raise a family together. But life had gotten in the way. His career, their travels, the endless possibilities of their busy lives. Children had always been something they would get around to discussing later, but later never came. The real blow, though, was knowing that his own words, spoken offhandedly years ago, had been enough to drive Emily to keep such a life-changing secret. Richard didn't even remember the conversation clearly. They had been young, not long after getting together, and he had probably said something about not wanting kids right away. Maybe even never, but he never meant it as a final decision. He had assumed they would discuss it properly one day, but that day never came, and Emily had made her choice alone. Richard took a deep breath, staring down at the papers in front of him. He didn't know how to feel about Emily anymore. The grief he had carried for so long was being replaced by something more complex, a mixture of love, anger, and regret. He still loved her, he always would. But now that love was tangled up with a deep sense of loss, not just for her, but for the life they could have had together, for the family they could have built. And then there was Sophie, the daughter he had never known, the child Emily had kept from him in an attempt to protect him from a burden he would have gladly accepted. Richard wanted to be there for her, to make up for lost time, but he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. They were strangers, connected by blood but separated by years of silence and secrets. As much as he wanted to jump into this new role, father, grandfather, he knew it wasn't that simple. Sophie had her own life, her own experiences, and her own pain. He couldn't just waltz in and expect to fill a void that had existed for years. He would have to earn her trust, earn his place in her life, and that wasn't something that could happen overnight. The phone on his desk buzzed, pulling Richard out of his thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. "Are you free tomorrow? Daniel has a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and I was wondering if you wanted to come with us. No pressure, just thought you might want to be there." Richard stared at the screen, his heart swelling with both anxiety and hope. Sophie was reaching out. She was offering him a chance to be part of her and Daniel's life, to take the first steps toward building something new together. He quickly typed a response, trying not to overthink it. "I'd love to come. Just let me know the time." As soon as he hit send, a sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He wasn't sure what to expect or how it would feel to step into this new role, but he was willing to try. For Sophie, for Daniel, for the family he had lost, and the one he still had a chance to be part of. The next day, Richard met Sophie outside the pediatrician's office. She was standing by the entrance, Daniel bundled up in his stroller, looking both relieved and nervous to see him. Richard couldn't help but smile as he walked up to them. Daniel's big eyes blinked up at him from under his hat, and for a moment, all of Richard's doubts melted away. "Hey," Sophie said, her voice soft but welcoming. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," Richard replied, crouching down to get a closer look at Daniel. "How's the little guy doing?" "He's good, a bit fussy, but nothing unusual." Sophie smiled faintly as she adjusted Daniel's blanket. "I thought it might be nice for you to be here. You know, to get to know him a little." Richard's heart warmed at her words. It wasn't easy for her to offer this. He knew that. Sophie had her walls up, and for good reason. But she was trying. And that was more than he could have asked for. They walked into the office together, making small talk as they waited for Daniel's appointment. Richard found himself watching Sophie, seeing the way she interacted with her son, the tenderness in her voice, the way she seemed to understand his every need. It was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. He couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if he had been there for her, if he had been part of her life from the beginning. But there was no use in dwelling on the past. He was here now, and that was what mattered. The doctor's appointment was routine, just a quick checkup, but for Richard, it felt monumental. As he sat beside Sophie, watching the doctor weigh and measure Daniel, he realized that these were the moments he had been missing out on all his life. The simple, everyday moments of being a parent, of watching a child grow and learn. It wasn't glamorous or grand, but it was real. It was the kind of connection he had longed for without even realizing it. When the appointment was over, and they were walking back out into the crisp afternoon air, Richard turned to Sophie, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "for letting me be part of this." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're welcome. I want you to be part of it. I know it's not going to be easy, but I think we can figure it out." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. They were on the same page, both cautious but hopeful, both willing to take the steps necessary to build something together. As they stood there, watching the sunset behind the city skyline, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, despite everything, there was still time to heal, time to make amends, time to be the father and grandfather he had always wanted to be. As the days turned into weeks, Richard began to feel a sense of cautious optimism growing inside him. He had started spending more time with Sophie and Daniel, finding a rhythm in their interactions that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. The initial awkwardness of their new relationship was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a fragile but genuine connection. Richard had been careful not to overstep, allowing Sophie to set the pace while making it clear that he was fully committed to being part of their lives. One afternoon, Sophie invited Richard to her apartment for the first time. It was a modest place, small but cozy, and as Richard stepped inside, he could see the care Sophie had put into making it a home for her and Daniel. Toys were scattered on the living room floor, and a soft blanket was draped over the couch. The apartment smelled faintly of baby lotion and freshly brewed coffee. "Make yourself comfortable," Sophie said, motioning toward the couch as she took Daniel out of his stroller. "I'll get us some coffee." Richard nodded, sitting down and looking around the room. He felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride in seeing the life Sophie had built for herself, but also a deep sense of regret that he hadn't been there to witness any of it. He had missed so much, and no matter how hard he tried to move forward, that sense of loss would always linger. As Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Richard's gaze drifted to a small photo frame on the bookshelf. It was a picture of Sophie holding Daniel, both of them smiling at the camera, their eyes bright with joy. It was a simple image, but it hit Richard hard. He realized that he was looking at the family he never knew he had, a family he was only now beginning to understand. Sophie returned a few moments later, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. She handed one to Richard and sat down across from him, adjusting Daniel on her lap. The baby cooed softly, his chubby hands reaching for his mother's hair. "So," Sophie said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking a lot lately, about everything, about us, about Mom, and there's something else I think you should know." Richard looked up from his coffee, his heart rate picking up slightly. He had grown used to the idea that there would always be new revelations when it came to Emily and Sophie's past. But that didn't make them any easier to hear. "What is it?" he asked carefully. Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers absent-mindedly playing with Daniel's tiny hand. "After we talked about Mom and why she kept me a secret from you, I started digging a little deeper. I wanted to understand more about her life, about why she made the choices she did. And I found something that, well, it changes things." Richard frowned, setting his mug down on the coffee table. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated for a moment before standing up and walking over to the bookshelf. She pulled out a small box that Richard hadn't noticed before, bringing it back to the couch and setting it between them. "This," Sophie said quietly, opening the box, "was in Mom's things. It's a letter, but it's not from her. It's from someone else. Someone I think you knew." Richard's stomach tightened as Sophie handed him the letter. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. It was addressed to Emily, but the signature at the bottom made Richard's heart stop. It was from someone named James. Not just any James, but James Porter, an old friend of Richard's from his younger days. The two had lost touch over the years, but they had been close once, long before Richard had met Emily. As he read the letter, Richard's blood ran cold. "Emily, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to put it down on paper, even if only for my own peace of mind. I know we've kept this secret for so long, but it's weighing on me now more than ever. Richard has no idea about what happened between us, and I can't bear to keep pretending. I'm not asking you to tell him. I know how complicated things are, but I need you to know that I've never stopped thinking about you, about what we had. If things were different, I would have fought harder for you, but I know you made your choice. I just hope you're happy, even if it's not with me. With love, James." Richard's hands trembled as he finished reading. He stared at the letter, his mind reeling. James and Emily. Had they been together? Had there been something between them that he had never known about? Sophie watched him carefully, her expression full of empathy. "I didn't want to tell you right away," she said softly. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, but I thought you deserved to know." Richard couldn't find the words. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the revelation crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had known James for years, trusted him, considered him a friend, but this letter suggested something entirely different, something that Richard hadn't even considered. "Are you saying," Richard began, his voice shaking, "are you saying that James and Emily—" Sophie nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I don't know all the details. I don't know when it happened or how long it lasted. But, yeah, it seems like they were involved at some point." Richard felt like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He stood up, pacing the small living room as his mind raced. He had always believed that he and Emily had shared something special, something unbreakable. But now, this letter, it called everything into question. Had Emily loved James? Had she kept this secret, too, out of fear of losing Richard? Or had there been something more? Something that Richard had been blind to all along? "I can't believe this," Richard muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what to think." Sophie stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. "I know this is hard, Richard. Believe me, I've been struggling with it too. But I don't think Mom ever wanted to hurt you. I think she was just scared. Like she was with everything else." Richard swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness boiling inside him. He had spent years mourning Emily, grieving for the life they had lost. And now it seemed like that life had been built on lies, on secrets he had never known. "What do we do with this?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "How do we move forward from here?" Sophie sighed, her eyes filled with the same uncertainty Richard felt. "I don't know. I wish I had the answers. But I think it's just going to take time. Time to process everything. Time to figure out what it all means." Richard nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. He didn't know how to move forward, how to reconcile the love he had for Emily with the truth of her relationship with James. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to lose Sophie. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. "I don't want to lose you," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Whatever happens, whatever we find out, I don't want this to come between us." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're not going to lose me, Richard. We're in this together." Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the answer he had been hoping for, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The revelation about James Porter consumed Richard over the next few days. He tried to make sense of it, but no matter how much he thought about it, the answers remained elusive. His mind replayed old memories, moments from his past with both Emily and James, searching for clues that might have hinted at this secret. But there was nothing, no moment that stood out, no suspicion that had ever crossed his mind. How could he have missed it? Richard found himself pacing his apartment late into the night, unable to sleep. The letter Sophie had found was always on his mind. It raised so many questions. Had Emily loved James? Had it been a brief affair, or something more serious? And why had James never told him the truth? More than anything, Richard felt a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted both of them, Emily as his wife and James as one of his closest friends. But now, that trust felt shattered, replaced by a gnawing doubt that wouldn't go away. The next morning, Richard made a decision. He needed answers. He couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. After some searching, he found James's contact information. They hadn't spoken in years, not since they had drifted apart after Emily's death. But this wasn't something Richard could let go of. He had to confront him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Richard dialed the number. It rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" James's voice was older, more tired than Richard remembered, but it was unmistakable. "James," Richard said, his voice tight. "It's Richard Lawson." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Richard could hear the hesitation in James's voice when he finally responded. "Richard, it's been a long time." "It has," Richard agreed, keeping his tone calm even though the tension was building inside him. "I need to talk to you. About Emily." Another pause. "Emily?" James's voice was cautious, almost as if he knew what was coming. "What about her?" "I found a letter," Richard said, his words sharp now. "A letter you wrote to her, about something that happened between the two of you. I think you know what I'm talking about." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard could feel the weight of it, the unspoken truth hanging between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost resigned. "I didn't think you'd ever find out." Richard clenched his jaw, the confirmation hitting him hard. "So it's true, then. You and Emily, what was it, James? An affair? A one-time thing?" James let out a heavy sigh. "It wasn't like that, Richard. It wasn't an affair. It was complicated." Richard's anger flared. "Complicated? That's all you have to say. I trusted you, James. You were my friend." "I know," James replied, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Richard, and I don't think Emily did either. What happened between us, it was a mistake, but it wasn't what you think." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "Then tell me what it was. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like both of you kept a pretty big secret from me." James hesitated again, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. "It was a long time ago, before you and Emily were even serious. We had a brief thing, but it ended. Emily chose you, Richard. She loved you. Whatever happened between us, it was over long before you two got married." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. It was over, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. "Why didn't either of you tell me?" "I don't know," James admitted. "At first, it didn't seem like it mattered. It was in the past, and we both moved on. But as time went on, I guess we were both afraid of what it would do to you, to your marriage. And then after Emily died, I couldn't bring myself to tell you. I didn't want to add to your pain." Richard shook his head, his anger simmering